Good day, everyone, and welcome to the 2022 AALS Presidential Program. I'm Vincent Rougeau, AALS President, and it's my pleasure to welcome two distinguished scholars today, Professor Michael Sandel of Harvard University and Professor Kathleen Caveney of Boston College. And they'll be joining me for a discussion of Professor Sandel's book, The Tyranny of Merit: What Has Become of the Common Good. Let me begin with a few logistical details. Today's program is being recorded. After the introduction of our speakers, I will invite each of them to offer opening remarks. Upon completion of the opening remarks, I will moderate a discussion around some key themes from the book and from their openings that they have each provided. Then we'll reserve some time at the end of the discussion for your questions. And I invite you to submit your questions using the Q&A or the chat function. And we will do our best in the 15 or 20 minutes at the end to get to as many of them as we can. So now, let me introduce our speakers. First, Professor Michael Sandel. Michael Sandel teaches political philosophy at Harvard University. His books on justice, democracy, ethics, and markets have been translated into more than 30 languages. He's been described as the world's most influential living philosopher by the New Statesman. Sandel's latest book, The Tyranny of Merit: What's Become of the Common Good, was named a Best Book of the Year by The Guardian, Bloomberg, New Statesman, The Times Literary Supplement, Le Point in Paris, and The New Weekly in Beijing. It's also the subject of a symposium in the inaugural issue of the American Journal on Law and Equality. Sandel's legendary course, Justice, was the first Harvard course to be made freely available online and has been viewed by tens of millions of people. His BBC series, The Global Philosopher, explores the ethical issues lying behind the headlines with participants from around the world. Professor Sandel has been visiting professor at the Sorbonne and delivered the Tanner Lectures on Human Values at Oxford and the Kellogg Biennial Lecture on Jurisprudence at the Library of Congress. Professor Kathleen Caveney, a scholar who focuses on the relationship of law, religion, and morality, serves as the Darrell and Juliet Libby Professor at Boston College, a position that includes appointments in both the Department of Theology and the Law School. In 2018-2019, she was the Carey and Anne McGuire Chair in Ethics and American History at the Kluge Center of the Library of Congress. Professor Caveney regularly teaches contract law to first-year students. She also teaches a number of seminars which explore the relationship between theology, philosophy, and law, such as faith, morality, and law, mercy and justice, and complicity. Professor Caveney has published 4 books and over 100 articles and essays in journals and books specializing in law, ethics, and medical ethics. She's the chair of the Board of Trustees of the Journal of Religious Ethics and has been the president of the Society of Christian Ethics, the major professional society for scholars of Christian ethics and moral theology in North America. It meets annually in conjunction with the Society of Jewish Ethics and the Society for the Study of Muslim Ethics. Welcome to both of you. And Michael, let me begin with you.
Well, thank you, Vince and Kathleen, for this conversation. The tyranny of merit. It's paradoxical to speak of merit as a kind of tyranny, at least on the face of it. If I need surgery, I want a well-qualified surgeon to perform it. Merit is generally a good thing. So how can merit become a kind of tyranny? Merit becomes a kind of tyranny when it creates a society of winners and losers, which sadly is very much the kind of society we've become. For decades, the divide between winners and losers has been deepening, poisoning our politics, setting us apart. This has partly to do with the widening inequalities of recent decades, but it's not only that. I think it also has to do with the changing attitudes towards success that have accompanied the widening inequalities. Those who've landed on top have come to believe that their success is their own doing, the measure of their merit, and that they therefore deserve the full bounty that the market bestows upon them, and by implication, that those who struggle must deserve their fate as well. This way of thinking about success reflects a seemingly attractive ideal, the principle of meritocracy, which simply put says that if chances are equal, the winners deserve their winnings. Now, in practice, we fall short of this ideal. Chances are not truly equal. Look at admissions to top colleges and universities in the United States. Despite generous financial aid policies at these places, there are more students in Ivy League and elite universities. There are more students who come from families in the top 1% than from families in the bottom half of the population of this country combined. So, and if we look at the percentage of young people who attend the top 140 most competitive selective colleges and universities, the percent who come from low-income families, it's about 3%. But the problem isn't only this. The problem isn't only that we fail to live up to the meritocratic principles we profess. The ideal of meritocracy, or so I try to argue in the book, the ideal of meritocracy has a dark side. The dark side is this: meritocracy is corrosive of the common good. It leads to hubris among the winners and to demoralization, even humiliation among those who lose out. It encourages the successful to inhale too deeply of their own success, to forget the luck and good fortune that helped them on their way. And it leads them to look down on those less fortunate than themselves. One of the most potent sources of the backlash we've seen against elites is the sense among many working people that elites look down on them. This, it seems to me, is a legitimate complaint, because even as globalization brought deepening inequality and stagnant wages, its leading proponents offered workers some bracing advice. If you want to compete and win in the global economy, they said, go to college. What you earn will depend on what you learn. You can make it if you try. We've heard these slogans from mainstream politicians for 4 decades. But what these elites missed, what they failed to see, was the insult implicit in this bracing advice. And the insult was this: if you didn't go to college, and if you're struggling in the new economy, your failure must be your fault. And so it's no wonder that many working people turned against meritocratic elites. So what should we do? I argue in the book that we need to rethink 3 aspects of our civic life: the role of colleges and universities, the dignity of work, and the meaning of success. Let's take the role of universities. We've cast them as arbiters of opportunity in a market-driven, competitive, meritocratic society. Those of us who spend our days in the company of the credentialed can easily forget something, though. Most Americans do not have a 4-year college degree. Nearly 2/3 do not. So it's folly to create an economy that sets as a necessary condition of dignified work and a decent life a university degree that most people don't have. Encouraging people to go to college is a good thing. Broadening access For those who can't afford it, it's even better. But it's a mistake to see this as a solution to inequality. The economist Rougeau and a team studied 1,800 US colleges and universities, elite, non-elite, selective, non-selective, public, private, and asked the following question: how many students at these places arrive from low-income families and wind up rising to affluence, top 20%? What do you suppose the percentage was? 2%. 2% of the students in these places came from poor families and wound up rising to the top 20%. Now, this isn't because universities don't give a powerful leg up to those who attend. It's because such a high proportion of students come from well-off families in the first place. Higher education is like an elevator in a building that most people enter on the top floor. It's not only that individual upward mobility through a higher education is a poor solution to income inequality. It also ignores political inequality. If you look at the composition of Congress or the Senate or state legislatures, there are very few members of those bodies without a university degree, even though the majority of Americans do not have one. 95% of the members of the House, 100% of the members of the Senate have four-year degrees. A third in the House have law degrees, and more than half in the Senate do. Now, as a result of this credentialist prejudice in political representation, very few working people or people with working class backgrounds ever make it into representative government. According to the US Department of Labor, about 50% of jobs held by Americans are defined as working class jobs, manual, clerical, and so on. The percent of people with a working class background or experience in the US Congress, 2%. In state legislatures, it's only 3%. So meritocratic rising through higher education is not an adequate answer to inequality. We should focus less, therefore, on arming people for meritocratic competition and focus more in our public life and in our political institutions on making life better for those who may lack a diploma, but who make essential contributions to our society through the work they do, the families they raise, the communities they serve. And this means putting the dignity of work at the center of political argument and of public discourse. Because we need to remember that work isn't only about making a living, it's also about contributing to the common good and winning recognition for having done so. A final point. The importance of renewing the dignity of work is brought out by the experience we've all had in this pandemic. The pandemic highlighted inequalities that existed before COVID arrived. But our experience of the pandemic revealed to those of us with the luxury of working from home how deeply we depend on workers we often overlook: delivery workers, warehouse workers, nurse assistants, childcare workers, grocery store clerks. These are not the best paid or most honored workers in our society. But now we began calling them essential workers. So this could be an opening for a broader public debate about how to bring their pay and recognition into better alignment with the importance of the work they do. Finally, we need to reconsider the meaning of our own success. We need to question our meritocratic hubris. Do I deserve the talents that enable me to flourish? Is it my doing that I live in a society that happens to prize the talents I happen to have? Or are these things matters of luck and contingency, not the ground of moral desert? Insisting that my success is my due, that it's all my own doing, makes it very hard to picture myself in other people's shoes. But appreciating the role of luck in life can prompt a certain humility. There, for the accident of birth, for the grace of God, for the mystery of fate, go I. This spirit of humility is the civic virtue we need now. It's the beginning of the way back from the harsh ethic of success that drives us apart. It points beyond the tyranny of merit toward a less rancorous, more generous public life. Thanks. Kathleen, what do you think?
Thank you so much, Michael, for your remarks, but thank you in particular for your contributions, not only to the discussion in general, but to my own thinking over so many years. I think I told you before, I did my dissertation on you, on liberalism and the limits of justice, which you must have written when you were 12. And it's still a formative book and still a book that I teach to my own graduate students. So I'm delighted and honored to be here, not just because of you, but also because of Vince Rougeau's friendship and work on the common good for so many years, and I'm delighted to participate in this essential conversation. I have 4 basic kind of topics for discussion, no huge responses, but questions that your book prompted in me that might be of interest to the discussants today. And the first of these is, what exactly is merit anyway? It struck me as I read through your book and thought about the application process to selective schools and everything that generations now are doing to get into places like Harvard, that, in some ways, we've got a very, very narrow notion of success and approval. SAT scores, sports, activity, instrumental charity, a package that's been curated and managed by application professionals. And I began to wonder, is that notion of merit even correct? Is it too narrow in its focus? Even if we accept the narrowness, I was thinking, does it actually measure even, kind of some forms of material success? I hate to say this to this room because it might, virtual room, because it might pinch a little bit, but look at valedictorians. There was a 2017 book called Barking Up the Wrong Tree by a science blogger named Eric Barker, highlighting a 1995 study that tracked the successes of 81 valedictorians for 14 years after graduation. And the research, which was published by my colleague, Boston College researcher Karen Arnold, showed that while all the valedictorians did well, none were really standout successes. Though 90% were professionals and 40% reached the highest tier in their field, there were no visionaries in the group. They didn't have creativity and risk-taking. They had the complete package. The people who did the best in some ways, according to the study, were actually more middling students, more independent, less liable to be turned away by the judgment of others, and more likely to take risks. And perhaps very, very good at one thing rather than, good at lots of things. So that was the first question. Second question that your book raised in me is meritocracy. What is merit for? And it seems as, we read the book that, merit in the minds of a lot of people, not your own, of course, is for individual self-aggrandizement, for winning, for standing out, for success and comfort. But the connection between individual merit on this view of merit and social contribution and claim for social support becomes increasingly less clear. But then how do we justify all the social subsidies of the great national meritocratic contests and credentialing mechanisms and institutions like Boston College and Harvard? At the end of 2020, Harvard apparently had about a $42 billion endowment. Now, not all institutions have endowments of that level, not even close. Many are struggling. But at the same time, I think we need to ask, if the purpose of education is giving somebody a private credential for a private benefit, why give it a public subsidy? Why no taxation? If it's not contributing to the public good in some way, why should they get such tax breaks? Well, we might say that a liberal arts education forms citizens who are able to deliberate and discern in a pluralistic society. But what are people actually studying? As it turns out, more and more people are studying business, not political philosophy, history, English, or let alone Latin or Greek. According to the National Center for Education Statistics, between 2009 and 10 and 2018 and 19, the total number of bachelor's degrees increased by 22%, and business was the most common field of study for bachelor's degrees in 2018 and 19, within each racial or ethnic group and for non-resident alien students. Between 2009-10 and 2018-19, the number of bachelor's degrees conferred in business increased by 9%, from 358,100 to 390,600 degrees. And in contrast, the number of bachelor's degrees conferred in social sciences and history decreased by 7%. So I guess the question I have is this system sustainable if merit is about success, and success is measured in monetary terms, and why should we have a transfer of wealth really from the people who aren't going to college to the people who are going to college, given the fact that it's very hard to make the case that they're contributing to the common good rather than to their own private good. So that raises, another question, which is about merit and money. In Michael's book, he talks about how the market measures consumer desire, and satisfaction of that desire, is a measure of success. We pay athletes, actors, and people with rare talents a lot of money. They have rare and desirable traits. Okay, that's fair, maybe. But is that really true of all the money managers, all those business majors at all those schools who use all those programs to increase wealth? Is that merit in the sense we're even talking about? How do we think about merit and money? And what does merit have to do with the common good? Michael just raised this question, and I think this is one of the central ones. How has COVID changed our perception of merit? The people who are keeping the society running are not the lawyers and the money managers. It's the hospital workers, the cleaning staff, the caregivers. It's the long haul truck drivers. The people who are necessary are not paid well, and they're also segregated by gender, race, and class. So what does this say about merit and what we think about it? It seems that up until COVID, at least, merit has had a glitzy side. Merit is managing money, spending money, getting prestige. But there's another side of work that's difficult, that's heroic, that's contributive. How do we hold those two sides of work together? How do we think about what work is in a society where it's both difficult and rewarding? And that brings me to, I guess, my third big question having to do with COVID. how do we think about the changing nature of work? In forcing us to think about merit, dignity, and work, Michael's book helpfully forces us to think about the actual nature of work. But what is work, and how do we imagine it? In the broader Western tradition, going back to the Bible, it sort of has two sides to it, right? On the one hand, it's meant to be kind of hard and difficult. The book of Genesis presents it as a punishment for sin, but it's also necessary and beneficial. Work contributes not only to the community, but also to the development of the worker as someone with a vocation and a calling, which is socially understood. I was pleased to see that in the book, Michael quotes Pope John Paul II's encyclical on the dignity of work. And as I went back to look at that encyclical, it became clear to me that in his encyclical, he had a certain kind of work in mind. It was almost like long-term unionized factory work. He tacitly assumed a paradigm of work that is stable. You work for the same place for your whole career, manual, productive, you make things, and collaborative. You work in the union, you work together with management, you work together with everyone in your context. But needless to say, the actual experience of workers and work today diverges significantly from that, right? Many people don't have stable employment. They move from job to job. Much work today is technology-based or in the service sector. And an increasingly number of people only have transient interactions with others during their work days. The emerging gig economy not only challenges our conception of work, but even our conception of fairness. The life of a gig worker is unstable, transient, and does not allow for long-term relationships, really. Think about your Uber drivers. It facilitates a certain kind of restlessness, boredom, and busyness at the same time, what the old desert monks used to call acedia, where you didn't feel at home in your universe. So in trying to think through how do we honor work, I think one of the tasks for lawyers as well as philosophers is to think about how do we sort and categorize work to recognize its changing natures, to find ways to make it humanly sustainable for the workers, but also oriented toward the common good. The common good. And here's the rub. I mean, in this day on, January 6th, where it looks, we've got the anniversary of the Capitol insurrection, I wonder how can we conceive of us all working together toward the common good, or come up even with a definition of it that works in a pluralistic liberal society. And as somebody who studies religion as well as law, I'm acutely aware of, religion's contribution to the culture wars and to the divisions, but also to its potential maybe to, find a way to draw some people together. And, you quoted, Michael, Weber on the Puritans and the Puritan idea that, material success meant success in the eyes of God, and kind of the individualistic aspect of some of the later Puritan thought. But then I thought, it didn't have to be that way, and maybe it doesn't have to be that way. I went back to John Winthrop's model of Christian charity. And John Winthrop, of course, was a lawyer, not a minister. He wrote it on December 31st, 1630, as they started the great experiment of Massachusetts Bay Colony. And what was so interesting about this speech was he was fine with, with non-equality. He said, God in his most holy and wise providence has so disposed of the condition of mankind as in all times, some must be rich, some must be poor, some high and eminent in power and dignity, others mean and in submission. So, this is very troubling today because I think we've all learned that equality is much more important and much more connected to dignity. But the piece of it that's also, I think, missing from this is that even Winthrop thought that none of these differences were meant to be taken advantage of by the people that had more, but were meant to be oriented toward the common good. And so the line that I like most from his speech is that every man might have need of others, and from hence they might all be knit more nearly together in bonds of brotherly affection. From hence it appears plainly that no man is made more honorable than another or more wealthy out of any particular and singular respect to himself, but for the glory of his creator and the common good of the creature. So, obviously the language is very gendered and, and difficult, for us to, to approve of fully today. But the idea that our differences are meant to contribute to our common experiment is something that I think both religious and secular forces in the society really need to find a way to affirm. And I think there are resources in both religious and secular sources that we can find for that. So those are my thoughts on your wonderful book. My biggest thought is gratitude to you for having written it and shared it with us. And I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you, Kathy. Michael, maybe you have some initial thoughts you'd like to respond to from Kathy's presentation.
Well, this was such a wealth of generous and trenchant observations, Kathy. Thank you so much for that. A few quick responses. On your question, what is merit and is our conception of it too narrow? I would say resoundingly yes. And you rightly drew attention to our undue reliance on SATs and LSATs and highly curated, cultivated college portfolios that's created a billion-dollar industry for those who can afford access to it. Part of the folly is the hubris of thinking that we, or that admissions committees, can actually judge young people, 18-year-olds, if we're talking about colleges and universities, or young people in their early 20s, if we're talking about law school admissions. Are we really confident that with these tools, we can predict which of these young people who apply will make the greatest contributions, either to the legal profession in the case of law school, or to society generally in the case of undergraduate education? I doubt it. And one reason I doubt it is, put aside the SAT and the LSAT. We both come from New England. Tom Brady was the greatest quarterback in history. When he was 18 years old and when the Patriots drafted him, he was not drafted first or second or third in that year's draft. He was the 199th draft pick. So if even the ability, the quite circumscribed ability to throw a football is that difficult to predict at age 19, how much more difficult is it to predict who at age 18 or 20 or 22 will really make the greatest contribution to society or to scholarship or to a given profession? There was a young applicant some decades ago to the Boston University School of Theology who took the GREs and scored below average in verbal aptitude. They accepted him anyway, and it was a good thing. His name was Martin Luther King Jr. The test said he was below average in verbal aptitude, perhaps the greatest orator in American history. So I think we should be a little bit humble and skeptical about the way we measure merit, especially when so much rides on it today, which takes me, Kathy, to your second point. What rides on it in the first instance is who will populate the elites, who will compete for the best jobs, the best careers, make the most money. But that in itself, and the intensification of that pressure, is, I think, corrupting what the purpose of higher education. Because the more we focus on conferring credentials and defining merit and offering opportunities for networking, the more we are distracted, by we, I mean those of us in higher education, from the intrinsic purposes of higher education. Back to your question, Kathy, what is merit for? What is the purpose of education? It isn't or shouldn't be primarily to equip people to compete for remunerative jobs. That's mainly what it's become. It should be to enable our students to reflect on their purposes and ends, to figure out what career paths and what modes of life and purposes in life are worth pursuing. But when we subject them to such intense pressure from such a young age, those who survive the meritocratic gauntlet, the anxiety-strewn, pressure-packed meritocratic gauntlet that American adolescence in affluent families has become, they are wounded. The tyranny of merit exerts injury on them as well as unfairness on those it leaves behind. And then finally, just to say something about your last very important point about the changing nature of work, Kathy. Technology, we all tell ourselves, is changing the nature of work. And so we focus on figuring out how we can adapt to what technology is delivering. And we forget that we assume technology is an autonomous force, like the weather, an act of nature to which we must simply adapt. Well, now these days, we've even gotten over viewing nature that way. But we also need to get over viewing technology that way. Daniel Markovits, a colleague who wrote a very, very interesting book on meritocracy, points out that the growing returns, the college premium to those who are well-educated, well-credentialed in law and generally, that had a lot to do with the surplus of skilled, highly skilled workers, bending technology to favor highly skilled workers. And a number of economists have pointed this out. So right at the center of any project for the dignity of work, Kathy, back to your point, is to ask, what kind of technological innovation should we invest in and encourage that is worker friendly, that supports and augments, especially middle skilled labor, rather than seeks, as some do, and some in Silicon Valley do, to replace middle skilled workers. And finally, this goes to the broader ethical theme about contributive justice. Quoting Winthrop, he spoke about our need for others. But need morally points in two directions. It suggests the need for distributive justice so that everybody's basic human needs are met. But it also points in the direction of contributive justice, because our fundamental need is to be needed by our fellow human beings, so that we develop our talents and capacities to answer those needs and win social honor and recognition and respect for doing so. This is contributive justice. And I think part of what fuels the anger and resentment abroad in the land is not only the lack of distributive justice, but also the sense among many working people that the work they do is no longer valued, if it ever was, or appreciated, or respected, or the source of social recognition and esteem, which suggests that renewing the dignity of work requires changing policies, tax policies, for example, and investment policies, but also attitudes. I've only scratched the surface of the rich array of comments that Kathy has offered, Vince, but we also want to bring you into the discussion.
This has been wonderful hearing from both of you, but here's I thought maybe I'd throw out something that I think both of your comments are pointing to, and it's the notion of social solidarity. And to kind of foreground that a bit, Michael, you wrote a lot about the rhetoric of rising in American culture and the kind of myth making around the ability to rise. But then you also noted, which many others have done as well, that actually in the more egalitarian social welfare democracies around the world, the poor are actually in a much better position to rise. Data show that they're more likely to move up in the socioeconomic hierarchy than similarly situated people in the United States. And you said something I thought very profound, that the model we have of our social welfare state in the United States does not have a sufficient ethic of solidarity to support the notion that we need to help one another,
Right.
and to build a society that will function, and to build a democracy that will be strong. So I thought in this diverse multiracial democracy in which we live, maybe the two of you could comment a little bit on how we might create the kind of solidarity that we obviously need to accomplish some of the goals that you're both talking about.
Right. Kathy, do you want to?
I'll let you go first.
Okay.
I'm thinking something, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, first, Vince, I very much agree, and this is central. We in America have often comforted ourselves by saying, yes, we may have more inequality than various European social democracies, but we have mobility. In America, it's always possible to rise. No one is consigned to the fate of their birth. Whereas in Europe, these class-ridden old European societies, they have rigid structures of mobility. That was our consolation. Mobility was and the American answer to inequality. But just as you say, Vince, this is no longer true, if it ever was. The societies with greater degrees of equality and stronger institutions of solidarity are the ones where mobility, upward mobility, is greater. In Denmark, for example, it takes on average just 2 generations for a family, a low-income family, to rise to middle income status, 2 generations. In the United States, it takes 5.
Really?
And the same general point is borne out by looking at individuals rising 1 generation to the next. Children born into poor families, how likely are they to rise to the middle or to the top income scale? And by that measure, the United States lags behind most Northern European countries. We lag behind Canada. So it turns out that having a generous safety net and support, public support for education and for health and income support and housing and so on, enables mobility. Mobility is not an alternative to equality. Equality is a precondition of there being genuine mobility. And so, Vince, you rightly, press us to reflect on what might be done about that. And Kathy may have some thoughts about this. I would just give one small example to start us off. We woefully underinvest in the United States in those forms of learning on which most people depend to prepare themselves for the world of work. I'm thinking of community colleges and vocational and technical training centers. An economist at Brookings figured that the amount we spend helping young people go to colleges and universities is 162 billion a year.
Right.
The amount we spend on technical and vocational training, 1.1 billion, 162 to 1.1, which reflects not only the failure adequately to finance those forms of learning that do not depend on a college degree, but it also reflects our values. It also reflects the steep hierarchy of prestige that depreciates and fails to honor the kind of work that we all actually depend on.
I
Kathy,
think
what
that's
do you think?
I totally agree with you. I mean, I guess I'm even thinking back, I'm still haunted by the Capitol insurrection. And in order to help people, in order to have a sense of solidarity, we need to have a sense that we're part of the same community, that we are a body politic in some way. And what I'm afraid of is that, at this point, exacerbated by the, the media and the blogosphere, and that we don't have a culture of solidarity. We have a culture of contempt. We have a culture where we see certain people as not worth being in community with. And so if we're talking about creating a sense of solidarity that will expand across the whole nation, one of the things I think we're going to have to do is something that, that Winthrop talked about, is actually see one another as brothers and sisters, and not as those people over there who are strange and alien, and let's just hope they stay on that side of of the geographic divide and ideological divide between us. So that is one problem. The other problem, and I think we've had a missed opportunity, Michael, is like, I don't want to knock the meritocratic, stuff, totally, because I'm frankly a beneficiary of it. My dad was a vice principal in a junior high school in Seekonk, Massachusetts, and I got to go to Princeton, and I'm terrifically grateful for the education that gave me. But the fact is that, my generation, you talked about the 50s or the 60s, 70s, 80s, kind of the move to opening this. I still know a lot of people, and I'm friends with a lot of people that are not, professors. They're not quite sure what I do, but they know that on a snowstorm, I'm the last person you call. I mean, I'm kind of a nice little, addition, but you want the people that can take care of people, that can plow, that can fix the plumbing, that can, deliver the food. I'm in a context, I think, where I viscerally still understand the importance of that kind of workers, just because of the way I was, raised and what's here now. I mean, I think the social stratification that happens as you move into the upper middle class, and you have children who are in the upper middle class and then into the upper class, we don't have institutions where we mix enough with one another, and a lot of the institutions in which you might have done that, churches, synagogues, local community things, have been very greatly weakened by first the busyness, people need to work 2 and 3 jobs, and secondly, of course, by COVID. So how do we create the sense of solidarity that enables the sense of generosity and fight back against the pervasiveness of contempt, the belittling? That's what I worry about.
Could I just add one thought, really building on what Kathy has said, Vincent, on your question? We have lost in class mixing institutions within civil society. And this, I think, is one of the most corrosive consequences of the widening inequalities that we've seen over the last 4 decades. Those who are affluent and those who were of modest means rarely encounter one another in the course of the day.
Right.
We send our children to different schools. We live and work and shop and play in different places. It used to be that going to a sporting event or to a baseball game was a class mixing institution. I remember this growing up as a kid in the Midwest, a baseball fan, going to games of the Minnesota Twins. There were box seats and there were bleacher seats, but the difference between them was only about $1.50, $2.
Wow.
And this is in the 1960s, going to a baseball game, you could see CEOs and mailroom clerks sitting side by side, more or less. And then with the 80s and 90s, we saw, even in sports stadia alone, never mind the rest of society, the creation of luxury skyboxes. So it was no longer true that everyone had to drink the same stale beer and eat the same bad hot dogs and stand in the long lines for the restroom and get rained on, get wet when it rained. Now, there were those who could sit in a skybox, and when it rained, they didn't get wet, and there were no long lines for the restroom. And there's something appealing about that, but also something destructive, especially, well, I call it the skyboxification of American life, when the rest of the society follows in that pattern. Democracy doesn't require perfect equality, but it does require that people from different backgrounds, different class backgrounds and different backgrounds of race and ethnicity and neighborhood encounter one another, bump up against one another in the course of their everyday lives. And this requires public places and common spaces that we increasingly lack.
And no, I was just going to say, there was a study, I think Vince, in the Boston Globe, wasn't there? There was a study about, patterns of where people go on a day-to-day basis according to race. And there was a study that said, it's not just about where people, live, it's about where people go on a day-to-day basis. So we don't have, mixing of different, racial and ethnic groups, because people go to different stores, people just live their lives differently and on a day-to-day basis. So, I think that to see somebody as part of the community, you have to see them, and how do we encourage that?
Well, I want to get to some of the questions from the chat, and because I think some of the themes that we're sounding here will also be picked up in those. So the first question we got was, isn't the question about rise in economic status not so much about whether a poor student rises to the top 20% economically, but rather are they any better off and having had that upward mobility economically? And maybe we can just try to do some quick answers to these, and we'll get through them. If we have more time, we can delve more deep.
Well, I can give a quick answer, Vince, to that one, if you like.
Sure.
Yes. Typically, young people who attend excellent colleges and universities are better off than their friends in the neighborhood who didn't. So yes, and that's a good thing, and that's an important thing, but that does not show that, taken as a whole, today higher education functions as such a powerful engine of upward mobility that it can constitute a solution or the primary response to inequality.
And the subsidized support for that, as you said, we support the four-year colleges, but not the vocational schools and the community colleges. So it's why are we transferring wealth from the have-nots to the haves?
Mm-hmm. If merit should not be a tyranny, then, and I agree, this questioner says, what effect should it have? If none, it would seem like a form of communism. Are you suggesting a middle ground? And if so, how would you map it out?
Well, first step short of communism is a certain humility that those who succeed be more alive to the luck and good fortune that helped them on their way, to the sense of indebtedness for the talents and skills that enable them to flourish. Indebtedness to family and teachers and neighborhood and community and country, and to the times in which they live. I don't want to belabel sports metaphors, Vince, but LeBron James is a great basketball player. He makes an enormous amount of money. But he would be the first to acknowledge, I think, that this is not his own, his success is not his own doing for at least two reasons. First, yes, he practiced hard to cultivate his talents, but you or I could practice basketball 24/7 and not be as great a basketball player as LeBron James. So talent, the talent is a gift, not one's own doing. And even more than that, having the talents that this society rewards, that's also not our own doing. Had LeBron lived back in the days of the Renaissance, they didn't care much about basketball back then. They cared more about fresco painters. He would not have been lavish such honor and reward. So having the talents that enable us to flourish and living at a time in a society that prizes and rewards those talents, neither of these is wholly or mainly our own doing. And I think one can recognize this and then have a further debate about what political arrangements and what system of solidarity, Vince, to go back to your observation, can best express this humility in the face of success and this appreciation of the gifted character of talents, and having talents that happen to be rewarded now.
And also, I think just your point, Michael, about contributive justice. I mean, and not simply popularity or desirability. I mean, you know, to have the sense of recognition that there is, at least in my philosophical view, there's a difference between what happens to be valuable at a particular point in time and what is truly essential. So if your child is sick in the middle of the night, the nurse practitioner that can, you know, diagnose their fever and give them the medicine that stops them from being pain, you know, or in pain, it is so much more, you know, meritorious on a rich notion of merit, you know, than we think if we just go according to market value. So thinking about what really matters and what's contributing to your flourishing and all the people you're dependent on in order to flourish. I think that just broadening and rooting in reality our notion of merit rather than, well, I'm just popular. I mean, I don't think we want to turn society into a giant version of Mean Girls, right? You know, I mean.
I'm going to collapse a couple of questions that I think will help us dig into some of this too. So one person asked a little bit about the role of the family in meritocracy. And then another question goes to something you both raised, and it's sort of, you know, public goods, specifically the public education system. So how might we think about the provision of, you know, primary and secondary education in the context of some of the goals we might want to reach to improve the system we're talking about? And also, what's the role of the family in all of this, both in a negative sense and perhaps also in a positive sense?
Kathy,
why don't you
like
start?
Okay.
I'm thinking
all right.
slowly.
Well, the family is the source of, it's the seedbed of many inequalities, especially in a competitive meritocratic society, which seems obvious now, but was counterintuitive in the heyday of meritocracy, which was seen as a liberating and egalitarian alternative to hereditary aristocracy and caste societies. Because the idea was that in hereditary aristocracies, your fate is determined by the accident of birth. But nobody thinks that we are responsible for the parents to whom we're born. But if once careers are open to talents, and once everyone is given, or at least is thought to be given, an equal chance to compete for jobs and social roles, then it can be said that people have earned their place in terms of income or in terms of social and political influence and prestige. This was the promise of meritocracy. But from the start, and from the start, I mean 1958, when Michael Young wrote The Rise of the Meritocracy, he coined the term, he saw this was a false promise. He saw that it would, in a way, lead to this sense that I've deserved my place, I've earned it. And that this would introduce the kinds of divisions that we've been discussing today. Now, the family, it turns out, affluent parents have figured out how to pass their privileges onto their kids. And unless we want massive intrusion in family life, we're going to have to figure out another way to deal with the inequalities that result from different family backgrounds and degrees of support, financial and otherwise. And I think that now Plato had an answer to this question,
Not gonna work.
which was essentially to dismantle the private family and to raise kids collectively and to inculcate in them civic virtue and a concern for the common good and to figure out who belonged where. But short of dismantling the family, we have to take a different attitude toward the success, the different degrees of success in a market that flow from very different family backgrounds, along with the project of seeking a more genuine equality of opportunity. Part of what people may contest, though I suspect, Kathy, you're sympathetic to this claim, is my argument that even if we had a perfect meritocracy where there were genuine equality of opportunity, even that would not be a just society, because it would not eliminate the role of luck and grace and fortune and contingency in life. Think about talents as gifts.
Right.
And it would generate attitudes that were corrosive of the common good, the attitudes of meritocratic hubris. So it requires something, it requires a way of dealing with inequalities that arise from family backgrounds without dismantling the family, but in ways that go beyond simply perfecting equality of opportunity. Do you agree with that?
I do. I mean, but I also wonder if part of the trouble is we've got this narrow notion of the nuclear family. I'm not in favor of Plato's taking the children away. I'm in favor of in immigrant families, the successful uncle or the successful grandfather. My grandfather was one of 9 children. He became an accountant and a CPA, and he was given advice, and he would advise the smarter children of the next generation. There was much more of a sense of broader responsibility for nephews and nieces, for family friends. There was a network of family-like relationships that created, obligations of mentorship and support. And, maybe that would be one thing I would like to see encouraged. The mobility of American society, the sense that you just hive off with your own nuclear family and forget about everybody else except twice a year, I think is bad, because we do have different levels of advice available within communities. And then the other thing, Michael, I don't know if you agree with this or not, but I think my dad was a public school principal, and I'm a big supporter of good public education. I think it's a necessary thing. I don't think it should be funded on the town level, because then you just replicate the privilege. You know, Brookline and Newton, one thing. So how do we distribute the resources of public education as a common good? In a way that recognizes that all of our citizens are important, not just citizens who live right next to us.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I agree.
Maybe we can close on this note. Something I was thinking about, and someone asked a question about immigration and the ability to create social solidarity. But I also wanted to point to something you raised in the book, Michael, about when we see this reaction from working people, the sense of humiliation, the sense that they're being looked down upon. And given that today is January 6th, we also see among some of those people a real evilness and meanness and ugliness around issues of race and towards immigrants. And rather than trying to build solidarity with people similarly situated in this meritocratic professional technical economy, they've, many of them have grabbed onto these more tribal notions of identity and have really dug in on that, and that has also furthered the division. So is there something there? Is this something that's just a fact of life in a diverse society that people will retreat into these models, or is there something about American society where racism has such deep roots around slavery, and how that might also affect the notion of labor and work that makes it just super difficult in our context for people to see a shared sense of position in society that might allow for things to change?
I think very much the second. I think the second, Vince. I think America is marked by the sin and the indelible stain of slavery and segregation and Jim Crow, and any discussion of the dignity of work can't help but take place against that background and that memory. In fact, many of the affirmative ideals of free labor in the 19th century were defined in explicit opposition to slavery, and yet were intermixed from the start with racism, with fear of slavery spreading north, because that would also bring African Americans north. So the history of free labor and the dignity of labor is especially complicated because of the American experience of racism and slavery. And we need to face that directly. I think that it would, I think there is a tendency that we should resist, and that's the tendency of many mainstream professional and political elites who presided over 4 decades of neoliberal globalization and deregulation and outsourcing, to say the only problem with the populist backlash is that some people, unfortunately, are racist and anti-immigrant. I think there is certainly truth that some people are racist and anti-immigrant, and that fuels the populist backlash against elites. But it's not the whole of the story. And claiming that it is a way, I think, that the elites who were responsible for the bad governance that led to the widening inequalities and the wage stagnation and the job losses and the hubris that unfolded over 4 decades, it's a way of letting themselves off the hook and not critically reflecting on how they helped pave the way to Trump and to January 6th. Not without help. from a legacy of racism, but it's a kind of toxic concatenated brew of anger and resentment that resulted from racist anti-immigrant sentiment and the legitimate grievances against a neoliberal version of globalization that did leave a great many working people behind and left out and disrespected. If I could just end, going back to the theme of solidarity, Vince, that you raised and that Kathy has addressed as well, to end on a more affirmative vision. The person who coined the term the American dream was James Truslow Adams. He was writing in the 1930s. And we often assume the American dream is simply a matter of individual upward mobility, but that isn't what he meant. He meant something closer, Vince, to what you raised about solidarity, and Kathy elaborated about the common good. And here's the example. Here's an example he gave of what he meant by the American dream. He spoke about the Library of Congress, a symbol of what democracy can accomplish on its own behalf, a place of public learning. This, Kathy, goes to the class mixing point. He said, as one looks down on the general reading room, which alone contains 10,000 volumes, which may be read without even the asking, one sees the seats filled with silent readers, old and young, rich and poor, black and white, the executive and the laborer, the general and the private, the noted scholar and the schoolboy, all reading at their own library provided by their own democracy. And he concludes from this example that this scene is the perfect working out in a concrete example of the American dream. The means provided by the accumulated resources of the people themselves and a public intelligent enough to use them. And he said, if only we could carry out this example into all departments of American life, as he put it, then we would be on the way to realizing the American dream. I think that this picture connects a lot of the themes, Kathy and Vince, that we've been gesturing toward today about what a politics of the common good might look like and what would be required of a civil society that would make it possible, at least more within reach than it seems to be on this January 6th. Vince?
Well, Michael, I can't think of a better closing for our conversation. I want to thank you and Kathy for this really excellent discussion. I'm seeing some wonderful notes coming in about how much our colleagues have appreciated this opportunity to think about these very, very important topics. Thanks for joining us here at the 2022 AALS annual meeting. And I hope you'll have a chance to maybe participate in some of the other sessions. And thanks to all of you in our audience, all of our colleagues from law schools across the country. It was great having this time with you and look forward to seeing you later in the week. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.